What if the most dangerous prison is the one you would willingly rebuild with your own hands? Most people think Robinson Crusoe is a survival story. A story about a man stranded on an island, cut off from society, forced to rely on his ingenuity to stay alive. And on the surface, that seems true. But the deeper you look, the stranger the story becomes. Because Crusoe is given something that almost no human being has ever been given, a blank world. No government. No neighbors. No social expectations. No inherited institutions. No rules waiting to be followed. Just an island. A piece of earth separated from history itself. And yet, instead of creating something entirely new, he begins reconstructing something familiar. Why? That question may be far more important than anything usually said about Robinson Crusoe. Think about it for a moment. If someone removed every structure surrounding your life tomorrow, every schedule, every obligation, every hierarchy, every assumption, and placed you in complete freedom, what would you build first? Would you invent a new way of living? Or would you quietly rebuild the old one? This is where the novel begins to transform from an adventure story into something much more unsettling. Because the island is not merely a setting. It functions like a psychological laboratory. A civilization-sized experiment reduced to the scale of a single human mind. And the results are unexpected. One of the most powerful images in the entire story is not a storm, a shipwreck, or a struggle against nature. It is something far simpler. An empty island. A place with no owner. And yet the idea of ownership appears anyway. Why does that happen? Where does that impulse come from? Is it practical necessity? Or is it evidence that civilization survives long after civilization disappears? Notice the contradiction. Crusoe appears isolated, but his decisions suggest he is never truly alone. Invisible companions seem to travel with him, habits, assumptions, values, categories, systems of thought. The physical world has vanished, but the mental architecture remains. And that raises a disturbing possibility. Maybe human beings do not simply live inside civilizations. Maybe civilizations live inside human beings. The more we examine Crusoe, the less he resembles a survivor and the more he resembles something else entirely, a carrier. A carrier of order. A carrier of structure. A carrier of ideas so deeply embedded that they continue operating even when every external reason for them has disappeared. But here is where the mystery deepens. Was Crusoe rebuilding civilization because it was necessary? Or because he could not imagine life without it? Those are very different explanations. One suggests human wisdom. The other suggests human limitation. And that distinction changes everything. Because if Robinson Crusoe is really a story about a man rebuilding the world that shaped him, then the island is no longer the central mystery. The human mind is. The real question is not what Crusoe brought onto the island. The real question is what he was incapable of leaving behind. I want to stay with that question for a moment, because it points toward a conflict that is much deeper than survival. If civilization truly lives inside the individual, then what exactly is civilization? Is it a collection of buildings, laws, and institutions? Or is it a pattern of thought so deeply embedded that it continues reproducing itself even when every external structure has vanished? This is where Crusoe becomes fascinating. Not because of what he builds, but because of what he never seems to question. A person can only rebuild what they believe is necessary. And what feels necessary often reveals more than any confession ever could. Imagine standing in complete isolation. No audience. No reputation. No social status. No one to impress. No one to obey. What parts of your identity would survive? And more importantly, what parts would disappear? That question sits quietly beneath the surface of the novel. Because Crusoe is not merely interacting with an island. He is interacting with absence. The absence of society becomes a mirror. And mirrors have a way of revealing things we normally cannot see. One of the strangest truths about human beings is that we often mistake familiarity for necessity. We inherit systems, routines, assumptions, and categories from the world around us. Over time, they stop feeling like choices. They begin to feel like reality itself. And that creates a contradiction. The structures that help organize life can also become invisible cages. Not because someone forces them upon us, but because we stop noticing them. That may be why one of the most memorable images in this entire project is not a ship, a shelter, or a distant horizon. It is an empty island slowly filling with traces of an invisible civilization. An island with no ruler. Yet somehow authority emerges. An island with no economy. Yet concepts of value appear. An island with no society. Yet social logic survives. The deeper mystery is not that these patterns emerge. The deeper mystery is how effortlessly they emerge. Almost as if they were waiting there all along. And this is where the scale of the story begins to expand. What appears to be a single man's experience starts looking more like a compressed version of human history itself. Throughout history, people have crossed oceans, entered frontiers, founded settlements, launched revolutions, escaped old systems, and promised entirely new beginnings. Yet over and over again, familiar hierarchies reappear. Familiar power structures reappear. Familiar assumptions reappear. Different landscapes. Different centuries. Different technologies. But often the same underlying patterns. Why? Were those systems simply effective? Or were the people carrying them unable to imagine alternatives? That distinction matters because it transforms the story from a literary question into a human question. Perhaps the greatest challenge is not escaping a place. Perhaps it is escaping a worldview. A person can leave a city. A nation can overthrow a government. A generation can reject old traditions. But what happens when the deepest structures are no longer outside us? What happens when they have become part of how we think? This possibility gives Crusoe a different role than the one he is usually assigned. He stops being merely a survivor. He becomes evidence. Evidence that human beings may carry invisible blueprints wherever they go. Blueprints for order. Blueprints for meaning. Blueprints for power. And yet one mystery still remains unresolved. If these blueprints are truly hidden inside us, where did they come from in the first place? Are they products of history? Products of culture? Products of human nature itself? Or is there something even more unsettling at work, a force that makes every generation believe it is creating something new while quietly rebuilding what came before? Before we ask where these invisible blueprints come from, we need to confront a more uncomfortable possibility. What if the real conflict is not between freedom and control? What if the real conflict is between two different versions of ourselves? The version that wants certainty, and the version that wants possibility. Because the deeper we examine Crusoe's role, the more a contradiction begins to emerge. On the surface, he appears to be a figure of independence. A man separated from society, making decisions for himself, accountable to no institution and no crowd. Yet beneath that image lies a strange tension. His actions suggest that complete freedom may not be the victory we imagine it to be. In fact, it may be something far more frightening. Think about what absolute freedom actually means. No inherited map. No established hierarchy. No accepted definition of success. No ready-made answer to the question of how life should be organized. For many people, that sounds liberating. But there is another way to see it. It is also a confrontation with uncertainty. And uncertainty has always been one of humanity's greatest fears. This is where the story begins to reveal a deeper layer. Perhaps order is not merely a practical tool. Perhaps order is an emotional shelter. A psychological defense against the terrifying openness of possibility. That idea changes everything. Because if people create systems primarily to reduce uncertainty, then civilization is not simply a collection of institutions. It is a coping mechanism. A way of making reality feel predictable. A way of turning chaos into something the human mind can tolerate. And suddenly one of our memory fragments takes on a new meaning. A king with no subjects. At first, the image seems absurd. But look closer. The importance of a king is not that he rules others. The importance of a king is that he knows where he stands. Position creates certainty. Identity creates certainty. Structure creates certainty. Without them, the individual faces a question that has no easy answer: who am I when there is no system left to define me? That may be the crisis hidden underneath the entire story. Not a crisis of survival. A crisis of meaning. And once we shift our perspective, the island starts to look different. It no longer resembles a wilderness waiting to be conquered. It resembles an empty stage. A place where the assumptions of civilization become visible precisely because nothing else is there to hide them. This creates another contradiction. The structures we build to feel secure often become the structures that limit us. The same walls that create order can also narrow imagination. The same systems that reduce fear can reduce possibility. The same identities that give us purpose can trap us inside roles we never chose. Now expand that idea beyond a single individual. Beyond one island. Beyond one novel. Look at entire societies. How often do people inherit systems and then mistake those systems for reality itself? How often do cultures repeat old patterns because they seem natural? How often do generations defend structures they never consciously chose? This is where the story begins to escalate from psychology into civilization. Because the question is no longer why one person reconstructs familiar patterns. The question becomes whether every civilization does the same thing. History is filled with revolutions that promise transformation. Yet many ended by reproducing the very dynamics they claim to replace. Different leaders. Different symbols. Different language. But beneath the surface, familiar structures returned. Almost as though something larger was operating through them. Almost as though human beings repeatedly rebuild the same house while convincing themselves it is new. And that leads us to a revelation that is still incomplete. Maybe the most powerful force in human history is not power. Not wealth. Not technology. Maybe it is imitation. The unconscious repetition of inherited mental structures. But if that is true, another mystery immediately appears. What if Crusoe is not rebuilding civilization because he believes in it? What if he is rebuilding it because he cannot even see it? And if the deepest assumptions shaping our lives are invisible to us, how would we ever know whether we are creating the future or simply repeating the past? If the patterns shaping human behavior are invisible, then how do we detect them? The answer may be hidden in something surprisingly simple: symbols. Not symbols as decorations, but symbols as footprints. Every civilization leaves them behind. Every belief system expresses itself through them. And every individual unconsciously reveals their deepest assumptions through the structures they choose to create. This is where the island begins to reveal its most important secret. It is not merely a physical space. It is a symbolic landscape. A map of the mind made visible. What makes Crusoe significant is not that he survives in isolation. It is that isolation exposes what normally remains hidden beneath society's noise. Remove the crowd, and the individual becomes easier to see. Remove institutions, and the assumptions supporting those institutions suddenly become visible. Remove the world, and the architecture of the self emerges. This is the revelation that begins changing how we interpret everything that came before. Crusoe's role is no longer that of a castaway struggling against external conditions. He becomes a translator. A figure who unknowingly translates internal structures into external reality. The island becomes a canvas. The mind becomes the artist. And what appears on that canvas tells us something profound. Human beings rarely build from nothing. We build from memory. Not only personal memory, but civilizational memory. Ideas inherited across generations. Assumptions absorbed so early that they no longer feel like assumptions. They feel like common sense. This creates a powerful cognitive illusion. We believe we are creating. Yet much of the time, we are reproducing. We believe we are choosing. Yet many of our choices emerge from frameworks we did not invent. Consider another memory fragment. A deserted shoreline stretching for miles. No borders. No signs. No history written into the landscape. Yet invisible lines begin appearing long before any physical boundary exists. That image is not about geography. It is about perception. The moment the mind encounters emptiness, it begins organizing it, categorizing it, naming it, structuring it. This tendency is neither entirely good nor entirely bad. It allows cooperation, meaning, and stability. But it also carries a consequence that becomes difficult to ignore. The same mechanism that creates civilization can also limit imagination. Because every framework highlights certain possibilities while hiding others. Every structure makes some futures easier to envision and others almost impossible to see. Now the scale expands again. What begins as a question about one individual becomes a question about entire cultures. Perhaps the most influential systems in history were not maintained by force alone. Perhaps they endured because people internalized them so deeply that they continued reproducing them voluntarily. Not through obedience, but through identification. Not because they were commanded to preserve them, but because those systems became part of how reality itself was understood. Suddenly the mystery takes a new shape. The question is no longer why people repeat old patterns. The question is why some patterns become invisible while others remain visible. Why do certain assumptions feel natural? Why do certain structures survive centuries of change? Why do entire societies struggle to imagine alternatives to ideas they never consciously selected? And that leads us toward a revelation that sits at the center of the entire story, waiting just beyond our reach. Perhaps the most powerful prison is not a structure imposed from the outside. Perhaps it is a worldview that becomes indistinguishable from reality itself. And if that is true, then the most important question is no longer what Crusoe rebuilt. The most important question is this: what was he unable to see while he was rebuilding it? Before asking what remained invisible, we should ask an even deeper question. What was the island actually testing? Not survival. Not resourcefulness. Not endurance. Those are the visible layers. Beneath them lies something far more significant. The island was testing whether a human being can encounter a blank reality without immediately filling it with inherited meaning. And this is where the central revelation finally emerges. The deepest subject of this story is not isolation. It is replication. The remarkable thing about Crusoe is not that he carries civilization with him. Every human being does that. The remarkable thing is that his isolation makes the process visible. Normally, societies reproduce themselves through families, institutions, traditions, education, and culture. The process is so large and so continuous that it disappears into the background. But on the island, that machinery is stripped away. What remains is a single individual. And yet the pattern continues. That is the revelation. Civilization is not merely a structure surrounding people. Civilization is a pattern capable of reproducing itself through people. Crusoe becomes important because he functions as a transmission mechanism. A carrier. A bridge between one world and the next. Suddenly another memory fragment takes on a different meaning. A man standing alone on an empty shoreline. No city behind him. No government behind him. No society behind him. And yet an entire civilization stands invisibly within him. That image may be the true center of the story. Because it transforms how we think about human identity itself. Most people imagine identity as something personal. Individual preferences. Individual choices. Individual beliefs. But what if identity is also historical? What if every person carries layers of inherited assumptions accumulated long before they were born? If that is true, then the conflict at the heart of the story is not between a man and an environment. It is between inheritance and imagination. Between what has been received and what could be created. And this leads to a consequence far larger than the novel itself. Throughout history, people often describe themselves as innovators, reformers, revolutionaries, pioneers. Yet how much of what they create is genuinely new? And how much is a rearrangement of older patterns? This question expands far beyond literature. It touches politics, economics, religion, technology, even personal growth. Human beings frequently believe they are escaping old systems while unknowingly carrying the foundations of those systems into the future. New tools, old assumptions, new language, old frameworks, new frontiers, old patterns. The deeper lesson is not pessimistic. It is diagnostic. The story does not suggest that transformation is impossible. It suggests that transformation is far more difficult than people assume. Because changing circumstances is relatively easy. Changing perception is not. A person can cross an ocean. A society can cross centuries. A civilization can enter a new age. Yet the most influential structures may remain untouched if they exist within the mind itself. This is why the island functions as such a powerful symbol. It represents the closest thing imaginable to a fresh beginning. And yet even there, history continues speaking through human behavior. The consequence is profound. If the greatest forces shaping reality are invisible assumptions, then the future depends less on what we build and more on what we are capable of recognizing. Which leads to a philosophical question that reaches far beyond one character, one novel, or one century. If human beings unconsciously reproduce the worlds that created them, then what kind of future becomes possible when an entire civilization can no longer distinguish inheritance from truth? Before asking what future becomes possible, we have to confront the cost of failing to recognize the forces that shape us. Because every invisible structure carries a consequence. Not necessarily a dramatic consequence. Not always an immediate one. Often the most powerful consequences unfold slowly, across generations, hidden beneath what appears normal. This is where the legacy of the story becomes larger than the character at its center. The lasting importance of Crusoe is not that he demonstrates human resilience. Many stories do that. His lasting importance is that he exposes a mechanism. A mechanism through which assumptions survive. Through which systems reproduce themselves. Through which ideas outlive the people who created them. Once you see that mechanism, it becomes difficult to stop seeing it. Consider one final memory fragment. A prison with no walls. No guards. No locks. No chains. And yet the prisoner remains inside. Not because escape is impossible, but because the boundaries have become indistinguishable from reality itself. That image captures the deepest consequence of inherited thinking. The greatest limitations are often the ones that no longer feel like limitations. They feel natural. They feel obvious. They feel true. And because they feel true, they become extraordinarily difficult to examine. This is why the story continues speaking to modern audiences centuries after it was written. The details belong to a particular historical moment. The underlying pattern does not. Today, people inherit digital systems instead of maritime empires. Algorithms instead of frontiers. Networks instead of islands. Yet the fundamental question remains surprisingly similar. How much of what we believe is genuinely ours? How much of our worldview was chosen? And how much was absorbed before we were even aware that alternatives existed? The scale now expands beyond literature entirely. Every society transmits invisible assumptions to the next generation. Assumptions about success. About value. About identity. About progress. About what is possible and what is impossible. Most of the time, those assumptions provide stability. They allow cooperation. They create continuity. They help civilization survive. But there is a trade-off. Stability can become stagnation. Continuity can become repetition. Survival can become imitation. The paradox is difficult to escape. Human beings need inherited knowledge to function. Yet those same inheritances can narrow the boundaries of imagination. We need frameworks to understand reality. Yet frameworks can become filters that prevent us from seeing reality clearly. That tension may be the true legacy hidden beneath the narrative. Not a lesson about one individual, but a lesson about the human condition itself. Every generation receives a world it did not create. Every generation believes it sees that world clearly. And every generation carries blind spots that are almost impossible to recognize from within. This realization changes the role of Crusoe once again. He is no longer simply a carrier of civilization. He becomes a warning. Not a warning about society. A warning about certainty. A warning about the assumption that our current way of understanding reality is the only possible one. Because history repeatedly shows that people are often trapped not by what they know, but by what they never think to question. And that leaves us with a mystery that still refuses to disappear. If the deepest structures shaping human behavior are inherited, invisible, and self-reproducing, then how would a person ever know they had truly stepped outside them? More unsettling still, if an entire civilization shares the same invisible assumptions, who would even be capable of recognizing the boundaries of the cage? Perhaps that is why this story continues to endure long after its historical moment has passed. Not because it offers answers, but because it quietly changes the questions. What begins as a tale about a solitary individual gradually transforms into a meditation on what it means to inherit a world. And perhaps the final insight is not about civilization at all. Perhaps it is about awareness. Throughout this journey, one image has lingered in the background: an empty island. A place that appears untouched, undefined, open to infinite possibilities. Yet what ultimately gives that place its shape is not the landscape itself. It is the mind encountering the landscape. That may be the deepest truth hidden within the story. Human beings never arrive in an empty world. Even when the world appears empty, we bring something with us. Memories. Assumptions. Categories. Values. Invisible maps drawn long before we began our own journey. The most important legacy of the narrative is not the structures that emerge. It is the realization that every structure begins somewhere deeper. Inside perception. Inside interpretation. Inside the stories people tell themselves about reality. Consider the memory fragments that remain after everything else fades away. A shoreline without borders. A ruler without subjects. A prison without walls. These images endure because they are not merely details from a narrative. They are reflections of recurring human experiences. The search for certainty. The need for meaning. The desire to transform uncertainty into order. In that sense, the central figure becomes more than a character. He becomes a mirror. Not because we share his circumstances, but because we share the same fundamental challenge. We all inherit ways of seeing. We all live inside assumptions we did not fully choose. We all participate in systems that feel natural precisely because they are familiar. And yet every generation faces the same responsibility to decide whether familiarity is the same thing as truth. This is where the story reaches beyond literature and enters philosophy. The question is no longer whether human beings are shaped by the worlds they inhabit. That much seems undeniable. The deeper question is whether we are capable of recognizing those influences while they are still shaping us. Because the most transformative discoveries rarely involve finding something new. Often they involve seeing something old for the first time. Seeing what was hidden by habit. Seeing what was concealed by repetition. Seeing what became invisible because it was always there. That is why the story continues to matter. Not as a lesson about the past, but as a challenge directed toward the present. It invites us to examine the invisible architecture of our own thinking. To ask which beliefs are truly ours. Which assumptions have quietly guided our choices. Which boundaries belong to reality, and which exist only because they have never been questioned. And perhaps that is where the final mystery resides. Not on an island. Not in a character. Not even in a particular century. But within the human tendency to mistake inherited vision for objective reality. Because if every generation carries unseen maps inside its mind, then the most important frontier may never have been a distant shore. It may be the boundary between the world as it is and the world we have simply learned to see.